Hi, I'm Nancy Shantou, and I'm here to read to you from Access to Power, a radical approach for changing your life. And I'm going to read from the Oppression, Alienation and Empowerment chapter. This is by Julia Kelleher. And I've been reading about oppression, and I wanted to, this is a longer story, but I wanted to read it to you, and then I'll probably talk just a little bit about it to give you an example of how oppression shows up in everyday lives. So I'll just read this and then I'll talk about it. Let's take an example from my personal life and examine how the forces of alienation played out during the incredibly complex stage of human puberty, when so many cultural conditions come together and put enormous pressure on a single person. Between the ages of 10 and 16, I fell in love with folk dance. And under the influence of oppressive and mystifying cultural forces, I gradually experienced a sense of core alienation and ultimately suffered a tragic loss of personal joy and power. My parents began folk dancing in Cambridge and Boston around 1967, at the height of a renaissance in folk dance, about the same time folk music became a mainstay of the 1960s counterculture. My mom and dad found enormous joy and empowerment in the community and music and wanted to share it with their children. I took to the world of folk dance as if the music were already singing in my blood. It was what I lived for during my teens, traveling through Poland with a folk dance company when I was 14, and performing in a Woody Guthrie tribute at the John Hancock Hall in Boston when I was 15. I actually received pay for the Boston performance, which was pretty amazing. When I danced, I felt alive in my body, connected to fellow dancers, optimistic about the future, and very empowered. As I blossomed into a full-bodied woman, my Catholic parents switched from being supportive to being cautious. They were concerned that I was young and beautiful and that older men were attracted to me. While their concern was understandable, the withdrawal of their support for the folk dance I loved was incredibly painful and confusing. This is isolation and mystification. Gradually, my flirtations with men became more sexually charged, and I became even more scared and confused. I was being sexualized constantly. Men would mention my breasts, blossoming figure, and mature physical appearance. The attention was both appealing and invasive. This is oppression. My parents' desire to shelter me, combined with their Catholic morality and sexual repression, complicated the situation by making me responsible for protecting my seductive body without any real guidance or education. More oppression. The oppressive and mystified forces of power and hierarchy in the form of accepted cultural beliefs about sexuality and gender began poisoning my authentic experience. Instead of going to the folk dance events to dance, I focused more on men. Who was going to ask me to dance, and what would happen between us? I began to obsess about my relative sexual attractiveness, felt competitive with other women, and was further isolated from most of my community as I hid these confusing feelings. My love of dance had started out bringing me exquisite joy. Now I was beginning to feel alienated. I was alone, more isolation, and submerged in contradictory messages, more mystification. In the landscape of sexism in adult relationships long before I was ready. More oppression. I would leave the dances early if a man I liked wasn't there, or I would leave with a guy and spend the rest of the evening kissing him in the hallway. I wouldn't be able to sleep at night, full of shame about what I had done. Instinctively, I kept most of my emotionally charged, confusing thoughts and behavior a secret from my friends, sibling, and parents. More isolation and mystification. At 16, I auditioned for the best professional folk dance group in Boston and was accepted. A few days later, I was unaccepted because they were afraid I was too young. The group had a history of sexual activity among the members, and they were worried they couldn't protect me on tour. When I spoke of my dream to study folk music and dance in college, my father discouraged me, saying, "You can't make a career out of folk dance." My optimism for the future was destroyed by a combination of my father's disapproval and my crushing disappointment at being rejected by the performance group. The overwhelming swamp of sexual confusion in my social relationships vastly diminished my genuine, passionate relationship with dance, music, and my body. I was engulfed in the trap of alienation, with no way to get out. In this state of excruciating loneliness, defeat, and powerlessness, I looked for any solace. I started a relationship with an older man, moved in with him, was disowned by my father, and stopped dancing altogether. It was years before I came back to dance, and it was never the same. The web of complex, overwhelming, and alienating social forces made dance a minefield of sexism, disempowerment, and self-doubt. My joy, lightheartedness, and innocence could not survive the attention I attracted. Even in recent years, when I go dancing, sometimes my experience will become uncomfortable based on subtle competitive behavior or someone else's desire to be near me. While I can now dance and enjoy it based on all the unlearning of alienation I've done, the outer world still contains external forces I can't control and often don't like. Dance itself, like music and singing and many other acts of art and community connection, is polluted in our society with imagism and perfectionism as well as sexism. We cannot escape the competitive hierarchy of values that causes us to covertly, sometimes overtly, compare ourselves with others and rate each other according to competency, clothing, beauty, age, and attractiveness. It's heartrending to feel the love I hold in my body for dancing and to contrast it with the intense challenge of being in a social space and powerless over my experience. I feel it as a tremendous loss most of the time. So I wanted to read this to you because I was teaching the alienation formula last time, where alienation, this idea that comes from Marxism, that originated around the disconnection between people who are making something and the objects they are making, the disconnection of labor, the work of creating something from the object, and the way that work became something that was termed unskilled because you were just doing a single repetitive task instead of understanding how to make the whole thing. That concept got taken by the Radical Therapy Collective and turned into a formula that we can apply in most of our life situations. Or alienation, this concept of disconnection and isolation that happens where we are very confused and heartbroken, comes from a combination of oppression, where somebody is keeping us from doing something we want to do or making us do something we don't want to do. Isolation, where we're too alone and separated from community. And mystification, where we have a disconnection from or a hidden or a distorted truth, exaggerated or distorted truth. So those three things combine in order to create alienation. And this oppression that we feel, this oppression in the world, we internalize it. This internalization process is something that in order to unwind and figure out, we have to figure out what's our part, what's the part that we've internalized and that we're doing to ourselves, and what's out in the world, the part that we don't have any power over. We might be able to influence it, we might be able to take collective action against it, but we can't stop it or change it individually and single-handedly by ourselves. It's out in the culture and it's bigger than us. And this act of figuring out the difference between the two and being able to identify what we're powerless over, then we can start to see what we have power over. And I really love this example from Julia because it shows that sometimes an understanding of something doesn't make it better. I mean, there's definitely relief in understanding, but it doesn't mean we can automatically fix it. There's ways that she's been able to reclaim dance, but the act of being innocent and connected and joyful and fully embodied in her body in the dance environment got really affected by sexuality and is still affected by sexuality even today. So I just wanted to give that example because there are real circumstances out in the world that we can't change by wishing them away. And when we understand that difference, we start to be able to claim the power that we have over our circumstances, the power of what we can do. But that doesn't mean that there's always a win. That doesn't mean that there's always a way out. I hope that helps.